So I'm going to talk a little bit today, and as Dr. Gillespie said, I have the hookup, so it really benefits you to stay until the end. But if you cannot stay until the end, you can absolutely email me, and I'll share the information on how you can order the book. At the intersection of Minnesota and Benning Avenues sits a Safeway, one of 3 remaining supermarkets east of the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C. In 2017, the store received more public attention than it had ever received after moldy produce and expired meat were discovered during a surprise visit by Ward 7's councilperson, Vince Gray. Every major news outlet in the district covered the story, many showing Vince Gray's tweets expressing outrage when he declared that Ward 7 deserved much better. The Safeway was inundated with news reporters, many of whom focused on the store manager who had only been a manager of the store for 6 months. One asked, do you think you offer quality food and service in this store? And they stood in front of this meat counter, kind of the irony of it because of the moldy and expired meats that were found there. I think we do, he replied. We've had where people come in and they open packages and we'll come back and we'll look and say, someone has opened this up. We found meat in other departments. A few weeks ago, someone was shot in the area. So just like I told some other person, sometimes you have people come in and they could be great. And then he couldn't finish his sentence because the reporter interrupted him with a very direct question. Do you think it's more challenging to run a store in an area like this? The manager was prompt with his response. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is we want to make sure that the well-being of the customers and the well-being of the employees is always taken care of. For people who shopped at this Safeway, most of whom were Black, Vince Gray's discovery was actually no discovery at all. They had come to expect that their local store would fail to meet their expectations for cleanliness, variety, and consistent customer service. In fact, the now public conversation was one that they had been carrying out in their homes, in their neighborhoods, and in one particular concerted effort, I like to tell people this, there was a whole Yelp campaign that people thought if they would just put negative reviews on Yelp, the store would finally respond. They didn't. Gray's surprise visit made residents more visible and legible to those who were outside of Ward 7, giving them credibility that they had not received before. And yet, as the visit itself became the center of an unfolding narrative about food access in DC, very little of the reporting made connections between race and class and supermarkets. So I start with this anecdote. That's Vince Gray. You see, he's looking like, give me some answers. This is one of the store managers. And this is a quote from one of the interviews that I had done 3 years prior to this occurrence. And this person said, they have a nickname for the Safeway. We call it the unsafe way. So I start here for 2 primary reasons. The first, I'll talk about it in my talk today. This particular Safeway was really significant in residents' food geographies. It wasn't always because they shopped there, most of them didn't if they could help it, but because of how the store became a foil of what they actually desired. The second, Vince Gray's visit and the subsequent media focus serves as a perfect example of how the geography of urban food access is framed, understood, and articulated, particularly by those who are in power. Safeway, as a place, is the where of unequal food equality and access, and it is naturalized as the place to look for how and where people access food. The Safeway becomes the central figure in a story about food deserts, one that we have probably heard a lot, and you can ask me why I don't use the term at the end. So this is a story that often goes unquestioned, and it goes something like, there are too few supermarkets, there are people in these neighborhoods who do not eat healthy, and as Julie Guthman has said before, it provides an opportunity for mostly white-designed and white-led politics and organizations to, quote, bring good food to those who do not know any better. So this phrase and this metaphor, food desert, captures the imagination, and when we hear it, most of us imagine a barren or an empty place. In its current circulations, the product, a neighborhood, often Black, sometimes people of color, almost always with few or no supermarkets, is the focus at the exclusion of both other types of retail as well as how people actually move through space, let alone the root causes of how this place became a food desert in the first place. This, although maybe unintentionally, masks the way that 150,000 residents east of the Anacostia River, most of them are Black, were and are always producing, navigating, and resisting the food landscape. A landscape that is not only unnatural, but is also socially produced in ways that reflect how deeply intertwined anti-Black racism is in the making and the unmaking of urban spaces. So if this Safeway is so terrible, and you can take my word for it, it's pretty terrible, where are Black people going to get food? How are they sustaining their lives? Racism, as Catherine McKittrick argues, is a spatial act, one that naturalizes institutions and people in place such that we do not question them. As a result, the Safeway itself is the problem, and we don't necessarily see the underlying processes that allow it to be so. In today's presentation, I'd like to disrupt this naturalization of unequal food access in two ways. The first one is going to be to explore the ways anti-Blackness shapes urban food access. So to think about food access as something more than just people deserve good food, we need to add more institutions, but to really think about how anti-Blackness is the actual root cause of some of the things that we see in these neighborhoods. And then the second is really centering Black residents in Deanwood who are often rendered ungeographic as the primary agents in their food environments. One of the entry points for my work is that we can turn toward the everydayness of anti-Blackness as an analytic. We can theoretically and methodologically challenge assumptions about the market and the ways that food inequities shape people's lives. I think this opens up avenues for us to reconsider and imagine constraint and possibility, harm and care, and destruction and community building. If anti-Blackness is, as Christina Sharp writes, an all-encompassing climate that produces premature death and opportunities to tend to those who yet live, and if it is also the precondition for the perpetuation of capitalism, as argued by Adam Bledsoe and Willie Wright, then what do we do and what do we make of those who survive? How do we see, read, and document their food lives within, alongside, and against the structural inequities anti-Blackness produces? So I just want to pause and point something out. So on the left is how we often think about race and racism in the food system, that it is a piece of this larger pie. We've got the global agribusiness and transnational corporations. We've got alternative food movements. And then we think of race as kind of an additive. What if we think about how this is impacting Black people or minoritized folks? What I'm suggesting is that rather than thinking of it as piece of the pie, that the food system itself is completely enveloped in the politics of anti-Blackness. A part of my project focuses on practical ways that residents navigate inequity. Shopping outside of their neighborhood is an example. The unequal food landscape becomes the site through which Black residents make meaning of their consumptions, their choices, and in some cases, their very lives. This meaning making is not limited to the materiality of the physical landscape. As I'll talk about a bit today, memory, nostalgia, self-reliance become embedded not only in individuals' experiences with food and in their communities, but in the geography of the neighborhood itself. This is, I think, an application of what Glissant names the poetics of landscape. So I argue that Black residents' critiques and their memories and nostalgia are not secondary, but instead they're integral to theorizing, feeling, imagining, and knowing the contemporary landscape. To understand this feeling, imagining, and knowing, I turn to Black feminist scholarship. And Black feminist futures and the practices of fugitivity, Tina Kemp explores what she calls quiet photography, or photographs that capture everyday practices of the subject and the state, firmly declaring that quiet does not mean an absence of articulation or meaning, and quotidian is not synonymous with passivity. Tina Kemp asks us, what practices of rupture, refusal, and futurity do images show? In defining refusals within ethnographic research, Carol McGranahan writes, to refuse can be generative and strategic, a deliberate move toward one thing, belief, or practice in community and away from another. Refusals illuminate limits and possibilities, especially, but not only, of those of the state and other institutions. So thinking with Kemp's notion of quiet and thinking about McGranahan's focus on the refusal in ethnographic work, I focus on everyday ways that residents navigate food inequities. And what emerge are what I call quiet food refusals. The ways that Black residents expressed care, agency, and dissent in their food procurement practices, in their memories, and in their hopes for the future. They were not always loud, and they weren't hypervisible. In fact, most people weren't looking for them or listening for them, but they are valuable. So today I'll focus on just 3 forms of these quiet refusals. For years, I connected ethnographic research in Deanwood, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood in Washington, D.C. Here are some of the demographics. Deanwood is outlined in red over in that upper northeast corner. And I like to tell people that, why is this doing that? I like to tell people that when I first moved to DC for graduate school, I didn't know where Deanwood was, and I would get kind of embarrassed when I didn't know once I found out about it. But turns out people in DC don't know where Deanwood is either. So it's nestled along that Maryland corridor, so right across the border is PG County. That figures very prominently in people's experiences with food, as most of them would end up going to go shop in PG County. That's important for later. So you can see Deanwood's characteristics alongside the averages for DC neighborhoods. One thing I will point out about this chart, obviously you can see the income disparities are large. The percent of people with a car. This is super significant to people who live in Northeast DC in particular, because even though we think DC, train, get around, all these different things, there are far fewer stops east of the Anacostia River than there are west of the Anacostia River. So if there's something not close to you and you don't have a car, you kind of SOL in a number of ways. So even though 50% seems kind of high for a city for DC, it's relatively low for a part of the city that doesn't have the same kinds of access as west of the Anacostia River. So, Black food geographies. What I came to know about the people who lived in Deanwood is that there were a number of strategies that they used to navigate this unequal terrain. Taking the geographic distribution of supermarkets as a product of anti-Black racism, coupled with the material and the imagined geographies of Black residents, Black food geographies refers to more than just supermarket preferences. Drawing from Catherine McKittrick's claim that geography extends to cover 3-dimensional spaces and places, not just what's in front of us, but can also be about the imagination. Black food geographies becomes a necessary epistemological intervention then, one that sees Black people as more than casualties of the state or corporate neglect. So there are these 3 things, the affective dimensions of accessing food, and this really came out in stories of elders who could see over time the way the geographic landscape had changed and how their store preferences changed as a result of that. The second one, navigating the unequal landscape by car, by train, by bus, by asking for rides from other people. And then the third one, altering or transgressing the bounded neighborhood space. So there's all this research that suggests, why do neighborhood boundaries matter if people can go in and out of neighborhood boundaries? Neighborhood boundaries matter, though, for reasons that we can kind of imagine. Certain neighborhood boundaries are policed more heavily than others. Certain markers make it easier for people to move in and out. One good example of this is Whole Foods. Whole Foods is, you might shop at Whole Foods, great. Whole Foods is a really interesting institution because there are cultural logics that occur in that space that make it hard for certain people to shop there. And by hard, in some cases, it means hostile. Right. So in DC, what's really interesting about an institution like Whole Foods is that it can capitalize on the Blackness of the city in its marketing and still not be in these Black spaces. So when we're talking about the boundedness of neighborhoods, people will often say, well, why don't people just go somewhere else? And it's far more complicated than that. So people both transgress those in times that they could, but what I mean by altering too is that neighborhoods are defined by the census. That's one definition, but neighborhoods are defined very differently by people who live in them. And so those boundaries would contract and expand depending on who I was talking to. And that informed their understandings of food in the city. In Washington, D.C., as in many other cities in the U.S., Atlanta, the chances of a full-service grocery store being close by depends on where a person lives. Where a person lives, though, is highly dependent on race and class, and that's not always by choice. Politically and geographically organized into smaller units known as wards, Washington, D.C. reflects these race and class inequities that plague all other U.S. cities, one of the legacies of enduring racial segregation. The Anacostia River has long been a dividing line for both the spatial inequities that are reflected in the city, but also the embodied lived experiences patterned along race and class. So you can see here about income. One of the things I used to have on the slide was the percent of people who were diabetic and how that's patterned along race, class, and these wards. I took it off because it's hard to have those conversations with people in public health. No offense if you're in public health in here. So the Anacostia River has been this dividing line, and it's a paradox. 5 bridges cross the Anacostia. So it's kind of illustrating this connectedness, but the people who live there are disconnected and easily abandoned. Not all are poor, but almost all are African American. So Ward 7 and Ward 8 are both overwhelmingly black, ecologically isolated and disadvantaged compared to other parts of the city. Both represent the lowest average household incomes and the highest percentages of overweight and obese residents and those with diabetes. Unsurprisingly, when we map grocery stores, we can see this burden very clearly. Okay, so I'm gonna try this. I'm really bad at these things. All right, so here's Ward 7, here's Ward 8. I put these two maps side by side because someone always asks, is it race or is it class? And what I want to illustrate is obviously we cannot untangle those two things. So on this first map, we look at the percentage of black and African American. The darker the color, the greater percentage of African Americans, right? There's 1, 2, 3 icons here to represent the supermarkets. You can see what this looks like in other parts of the city. If we look at it by income, darker means lower income, the darker the gradient. Also, this is the Anacostia, this is the dividing line, Anacostia River. We see those, the darkest color east of the Anacostia River. So don't ask me if it's race or class, okay? It's both. So when we look at these maps and we see these stark disparities, and actually there's 4 icons on this map. There are only 2 supermarkets east of the Anacostia now, and there are about 150,000 residents east of the Anacostia. So this didn't occur overnight, of course. So the making and unmaking of urban food environments inextricably linked to race and class, this has been in constant flux, particularly since the 1960s. After the uprisings in 1967 and 1968, blackness and violence became linked, becoming one of the top concerns cited by supermarkets, second only to claims about profitability. This is a magazine cover from one of the supermarket trade magazines in 1967. It features stories about 3 cities that had experienced uprisings. And alongside of this is a quote from Mary Gardner Jones, who was the first woman to be a trade commissioner in the US. And she says, it's no surprise that retailers generally, including food chains, have become a major target for the venting of the Negro's frustration. I put these two side to side because what she is saying, she was pretty progressive for her time in 1967 to say this. And what is happening in this Food Topics magazine are people really questioning if supermarkets can be viable in cities if people are going to be violent in the ways that they're violent. So even when unintentionally, supermarkets reflect back to us the kinds of social inequities that exist more broadly. So when white and middle class residents moved out of the city, compromising the city's tax bases, so too did supermarkets, despite claims from chains like Safeway that they would actually not abandon the city's most vulnerable residents. The reality is actually much closer to what Michael Mudd, a former executive for Kraft Foods, said in a 1990 interview about poor nutrition and food access. In the interview, he said, quote, "Stores aren't miniature health and human services departments. A company doesn't have a social obligation to instruct consumers on the best way to handle their health or even how to manage getting food," end quote. So where did residents go? How did they navigate this terrain? In a 2016 survey I conducted with a collaborator from the neighborhood, respondents were more likely to be on the upper end of the income spectrum, higher than the median income for Deanwood specifically and Ward 7 more generally. And I think this is important because the way we labeled low-income neighborhoods excludes, or it kind of precludes the fact that there is actually economic diversity in these neighborhoods. So at the time that I did this survey, among the 101 participants, 56 of them reported incomes at $70,000 a year or more. And they were more likely to report owning their homes. Regardless of income, 52% of the respondents reported that they were more likely to shop outside of the neighborhood. The survey, one of the interesting things about the survey is it revealed that even when not asked specifically, residents were ready and willing to share critiques of one of the two stores that was left, the Safeway that I opened the presentation with. In the survey, I did not ask about Safeway, but I gave an opportunity for residents to add open-ended qualitative responses. So these are some, there are far more than this, but this kind of illustrates the range of critiques that people had about their Safeway. Ranging from overcrowdedness, poor customer service, poor quality, responses indicated that even when Safeway was the closest and the most convenient, it was often not their first place to shop. For many residents, particularly those with transportation or more money, they would choose to go elsewhere. This is really important as we're thinking about what do we do about urban food crises. Is the answer to just add another store? What I would argue is that for these residents, the answer isn't just to add another store, because if it doesn't meet their needs, it doesn't meet their expectations, it just becomes a store in the neighborhood. For residents who lived in Deanwood, the ways that race and racialization shaped their neighborhood food had implications not only for their shopping patterns, but the quality of the store, as indicated on the slide. Even for those who had cars or economic stability, meeting their needs outside the neighborhood came with considerable cost, at least in terms of time, and potentially in terms of actual dollars spent. For those in economically precarious positions and without cars, the costs associated with grocery shopping were really high, as considerations were not just about the type or amount of food available, but also about the amount of stress associated with shopping and decisions made based on access to transportation. Mr. Harris, an unemployed single father in his 50s, indicated that one of the stressors he considered regularly was how to get to the grocery store without a car. In his interview, he reported that he would go wherever his friend liked to go if it meant that he could have a ride, which influenced and constrained his choices in terms of where he would shop. He characterized grocery shopping not simply as a challenge, but part of his day's work. While there's debate about how and if having a supermarket nearby improves health, Mr. Harris's characterization of grocery shopping as work suggests that qualitatively, stores matter more than just about their health outcomes. They also factor into how residents think about time, their lives, and work. When he didn't have a ride, the work was even more arduous, as it included negotiating a terrain differently. So this is one of the quotes from his interviews. I have to go all the way down to the Safeway. This is good that you're asking. Just take today. Today, I really didn't want to pay my little 99 cents for my oven breads that I like from Safeway. I've been a little lazy. I didn't feel like going down there, he laughed, for a walk, and I decided to go to the corner store. I paid double. That makes a difference in the choice of store, and it made a difference of about a half a mile. If I had taken my bike, which I like to bike, I would have gone to Safeway, but then I have to think, is my bike going to be outside when I get back? Because I don't have a lock. With the corner store, I can watch the bike. See, these are really issues that now we have to think about on a daily basis. Alison Alcon argues that food considerations of the urban poor are complex and are often restricted because of income rather than geography. Yet Mr. Harris and others were clear that the geographic distribution of stores was a barrier, particularly when it came to making decisions about which stores to choose and what kinds of transportation was available. These barriers caused additional stress on top of the already stress-inducing conditions produced by racism and income inequity. Across the board, residents were clear. They understood these disparities. They were equipped with knowledge and tools, sometimes limited, to navigate the disparities, but they also had little to no hope or reason to believe that the store was going to be any different. They had high expectations for grocery shopping experiences, and those expectations, depending on resources, often took them well beyond the neighborhood boundaries. The average person who drove to a grocery store outside of the neighborhood drove an average of 22 minutes. In this way, Black residents were not waiting for others, so they transgressed the boundaries. They weren't waiting for others to improve the local food system by way of supermarkets, farmers markets, or even community gardens. Some did express a desire for more options and all of these things, but few of them believed that this would occur anytime soon for a variety of reasons, including their embodied experiences with anti-Blackness and the documented political neglect of Ward 7. Instead, they created food geographies that reflected how multi-layered structural inequities influenced the contours of their accessing of food. But not only that, these food geographies reflected the extent to which Black residents were not simply trying to meet their basic needs, but they were interested in finding food resources that met their preferences for both taste and for shopping aesthetics. Much of the literature on food access in Black neighborhoods misses this point, that Black residents want and deserve more than just the very basics. They operate in ways that demonstrate that meeting the basics actually is a reflection of anti-Black racism if they do not have additional choices. As residents navigated structural food inequities, their food geographies also demonstrated that these weren't just individual preferences ascribed to certain people and certain stores. Instead, they were spatial, inscribed in the food landscape, and they offered additional social commentary on the extent to which food inequities constrained choices but did not unilaterally dictate them. This is one of the many problems with the food desert metaphor. You can ask me other problems. Its application presupposes that residents are passive consumers who are trapped. Instead, even when their choices are constrained, residents demonstrate that thought and action go into not only critiquing their foodscape, but also into informing the ways that they seek options. Even for poor residents, there is a degree to which they transgress the boundaries of food inequities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about self-reliance. Memories of and stories about the past combined with residents' present experiences with unequal food access and their ideas about a future, and these created what I call nostalgic imaginaries. Spatial imaginaries are often used in social science research to capture how discourses, stories, and media circulate to create representations of people or places that are not necessarily just built on embodied experience, but could also just be a conglomeration of a bunch of people's experiences. These imaginaries are racialized and spatialized, as Black experiences with enslavement, Jim Crow, residential segregation, education inequities, we can go on and on and on and on, produce different outcomes for Black people. The Black spatial imaginary, produced through the ways Black people negotiate power, space, and confinement to create places of care and celebration, reflects a socially shared understanding of the importance of public space and its power to shape opportunities and life chances. How does a socially shared understanding of food access and responsibility come to bear on how residents articulated what they lost and how they understand the value of self-reliance? Some residents I talked to drew directly from their own experiences, namely these were residents who had been there for 30, 40, 50 years. And then there were others, mostly middle-aged participants who had moved to the neighborhood within 10 years, who articulated other things from the stories that they understood from their neighbors, but also from Black history struggles of self-determination. Whether they had personally experienced Deanwood with more food options was inconsequential to the articulations and circulations of narratives about a decline in self-reliance and racial solidarity. In these narratives, the presumed connectedness of residents in Black neighborhoods was key. And that idea structured residents' understandings of challenges to Black life and to food access. So when residents reflected on Deanwood's food past, it was not white supremacy, it wasn't racial inequity, it wasn't segregation that they often talked about. Instead, it was abundance, choice, community cohesion, or things that they thought they themselves as Black people had lost. This map is one of my favorite finds from the archives. It was hand-drawn by a cartographer in DC in 1948. And I'm gonna actually read to you what it says at the bottom. He described Deanwood, which is what he's drawing here. This area is mainly a Negro residential area. Though many of the houses in the areas are attractive and modern, the district has the usual characteristics of a Negro neighborhood in the outlying sections of Washington, such as a lack of adequate shopping facilities and a poorly planned and poorly paved street system. Why do I put this here? This is the reality of spatial inequities that date far back past the present. These are two people who currently live in the neighborhood who are questioning self-reliance, questioning the systems that their neighborhood used to have, and claiming responsibility for that in a way that is different from how this map is drawn and reflects that actually city planning is a part of the reason why this place has the kinds of inequities that it does. So in this slide, the question, where is that? It was more than a rhetorical question. Where is that pointed to an emptiness that wasn't simply spatial, but it was also affective? Where is that was a question about searching, about emptiness, about lack, and coupled with this second quote about systems that no longer exist, the result is a base of residents for whom self-reliance is a strong cultural logic and a platform, but who question its existence in the current day space. These tensions are in part a byproduct of the dissonance produced between individuals who pursue success and stability in a nation where structural barriers ensure that achieving them is difficult for most Black people. The reality of Black life in the US often includes both heralding individual achievement, but also using it as a way toward upward mobility, in the sense of collective well-being. The hope is not solely in individual merit, but also in the potential for collective uplift and resistance, despite the failures of the state and corporations inherent in racial capitalism. For younger residents, like these two people who were in their 40s, these were people who had been pushed to make something out of themselves. Their experiences of urban life could best be described as what Marcus Hunter and Zandria Robinson called, quote, the deferred dreams of the Great Migration. Persistent segregation, income inequity and poverty, and unequal access to resources, including food. For these residents in particular, the nostalgic imaginaries concerning the benefits of self-reliance in terms of food were not just based on their experience, mostly they hadn't had these experiences in Deanwood, but on the strengths of memories and, even when critical, a deep belief in Black people's institution building capacity. Regardless of their length of stay in Deanwood, some residents were clear that they saw one of the strengths of the neighborhood as its history of self-reliance, and it didn't matter how manufactured that history or narrative may have been, and that the loss of it was a major blow. So, in some cases, this tied directly to how residents diagnosed the problem. So he's saying he means residents, have forgotten what their responsibility is. And then toward the bottom, he says, and this is what the community is, so your food desert is a result. As Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor notes, how Black people in the U.S. engage in inequities is varied and it's complicated, sometimes resulting in internalizing responsibility for systemic failures because there is so much at stake. Participants never frame their assertions as taking responsibility for the state or corporate failures. Instead, the belief in and the reproduction of narratives of self-reliance functioned as both a reflection of embodied understandings of systematic failures and how normative they were, and as well as an example of how it is possible that inequities continue to reproduce themselves. When the state fails, who is there to fill in the gaps? As the narratives presented here suggest, nostalgic imaginaries do not forgive or erase inequities, but they are strategies through which residents sought to claim some kind of power. The ways residents remembered, imagined, and engaged the past was important because they often measured the food system and consumption in the present based on these imaginaries. These narratives were spatial, communal, individual, all woven together to create versions of the past that had implications for how they moved back and forth between different spaces, between understandings of structural constraints and responsibility, and for the lack of community cohesion that they experienced. Connections between Blackness, identity, and nostalgia demonstrate how imagined past become important data for understanding the social change that people would like to see in their communities. It was interesting that this one resident asked the question, where is that? Because I actually think the answer to that question was actually very much present in her neighborhood. In 2008, the DC Office of Planning presented what they called the Deanwood Strategic Plan, which was approved by the DC Council. The plan included removing residents from low-income housing units, tearing those units down, and rebuilding them as mixed-use, mixed-income buildings, even though we know from Atlanta, from Chicago, from New York, from LA, that this never works. Residents who lived in this public housing had planted a garden, And despite awaiting notice of what would happen to their homes or where they were relocated, they tended to this garden. They created it as a reflection of a commitment to continue living despite whatever the future might hold. This is one of my favorite pictures from fieldwork, because here, everybody's doing the wobble. But also, you may not be able to tell, but these windows are boarded up because people were already being relocated. So there's all this Black joy in the midst of structural things that are happening. This photo is inside one of the Gardner's apartment. And if you can imagine, I use apartment very loosely. If you can imagine a room that most of one side of the building is cinder block, one side of his apartment walls is cinder blocks. That has a bunch of implications for other things. But what he would do in the winter is try to cultivate plants inside that he could then transport outside during growing season. So his entire apartment, there's one window in the living room, there's one window in the bedroom, so there's 2 windows in the apartment. And every window in the apartment was crowded like this. So these residents didn't know where they were gonna go. And instead, they continued to thrive with this garden. In a 2016 conversation with 2 of the Gardners, I pointedly asked about their relocation and the destruction of their homes. I asked, how do you think this garden is helping this housing community? I know that you know long-term the city has plans to relocate you all and shut this whole thing down. One of the Gardners looked at me and said, you looked that up on the internet, didn't you? And she laughed, and then I nervously laughed, but I still wanted to know the answer to the question. So Ms. Johnson replied, yeah, well, that's why whatever, personally, myself and a lot of other people, we don't want to see this come down. We're not trying to let it come down. Do you see what I'm saying? I nodded, and she continued. So the garden and the trees and all of this stuff that we're doing is representative of we will not perish. We're going to keep flourishing. What does it mean to flourish? More specifically, what does it mean to flourish in the context of anti-Blackness, displacement, and the constant reminders that for the maintenance of the state as it is currently articulated, Black lives have to not matter? What does it mean to rectify that unmattering through food, memory, nostalgia, and visions for self-reliance? Kim Hall argues that, quote, good food not only sustains life, it enables flourishing. And then she continues on to cite Chris Cuomo, who says, flourishing is not an accomplishment of an autonomous, self-reliant individual. Real flourishing takes time and can only be accomplished with others. Flourishing, in other words, is made possible by our complex enmeshment in community with humans and non-human others. As people were forcibly relocated and buildings were boarded up, this garden represented one of the ways its attendants engaged acts of refusal that had implications not only for their food consumption, but also for the attachments to this place that they had called home, some of them for decades. The garden represented their determination and their desire to remain where they had planted roots. Contrary to asking, where is that, as one of the solidly middle-class participants had asked in the previous slide, these gardeners had declared, here it is, and here we are. In the longer work, which you can buy, one of the questions I ask is, what does it mean to engage these acts of refusal outside the immediate gaze of others, notably those in positions of power who had authority to make decisions like redeveloping the housing communities, and I would even go so far as make decisions about having the power over life and death in some ways. Through an examination of this garden as a space, and there are other examples in the book, residents negotiated multiple needs and desires within the context of the failures of public housing, none of which they were responsible for. And these framings of responsibility and community also led them to do things like try to tackle youth development, try to tackle low employment, try to tackle literacy. They did so many things using this garden as the physical representation of other things that they wanted to see. What these gardeners and other Deanwood residents believed is that the self and self-reliant isn't the individualist perspective imagined by white Enlightenment thinkers. Neither can it solely be reduced to a product of neoliberalism. Instead, the self in self-reliant is already always articulated as being enmeshed in community, as that is, as they know, where the possibilities emerge. Black food geographies are influenced by unequal spatial distribution of grocery stores, sure, but are not always defined by them. The where of supermarkets is only the beginning. Residents were not only concerned with getting to their preferred stores, but they were making connections between unequal distribution of food, agency of Black people across space and time, the contemporary ways to alter or navigate the unequal landscape. The experiences and the stories explored throughout the book were deeply engaged in refusal, and that wasn't always intentional, but they were refusing to allow the absence of supermarkets to completely define their foodways. These refusals are material, but they're also discursive, with food access becoming just one way to explore the ways urban residents navigated the contours of anti-Black racism on a daily basis. What emerges is a Black sense of place that is both cognizant of discrimination and inequity, and reflective of a complex web of possibilities, limitations, hopes for the neighborhood food system. So these stories that I share are not hypervisible or demanding to be heard, but they do require us to listen. So that's what I did, I listened. And then you also have listened to me. Often people ask me, what are the solutions? I engage in acts of refusal by not offering solutions, because I think part of the problem is that we look at people who are so-called experts and ask what's what to do. Don't ask me, go ask the people who live in these places who don't have access to food. You can ask me too, but don't ask me first. So these residents met their daily needs however they could, just like how Black folks always say, they made a way out of no way. They did what the majority of us do, whatever it took to meet their needs, especially if they had families. Yet, as many of them taught me, food was just one of the concerns that shaped their lives, and these concerns were varied and they were also really heavy. So there was unequal food access, unstable housing, impending gentrification, crime, economic precarity, but all of them stemmed from the same roots, anti-Black racism. So where do we go from here? I don't have all the answers. I don't even pretend to have all the answers. That feels like a great responsibility. What is clear, though, is that the global food regime, one in which components of our food system are in the hands of a very few number of corporations, is really not healthy for any of us. Within food and within these places where we purchase it, within our consumption, we reproduce power structures that undergird the food inequities highlighted throughout my book, but we also have the potential to resist those power structures. Black people across space and time have tried to manage and combat the amount of harm that is done by the state and by corporations. And what I presented here opens doors for thinking about coalition and institutional building, built on a nuanced understandings about how geographies are shaped and how they're made, but also how Black people, how poor people are equal co-conspirators in this. We're not doing for them, we're doing with them. So institutions and organizations aren't the focus of my book, but I do come back to them as a necessary strategy for moving forward. Perhaps best exhibited by the Gardner, self-reliance as a strategy is realized through concerted collective action that addresses multiple needs. On a small scale, this particular blueprint provides a way forward. All of the residents discussed in this presentation are blueprints for living and creating in what Christina Sharp calls the wake. Sharp writes, quote, "Living as I have argued we do in the wake of slavery, in spaces where we were never meant to survive, or have been punished for surviving and daring to claim or make spaces of something like freedom. We yet reimagine and we transform spaces for and practices of an ethic of care." And she defines care as in repair, maintenance, or attention. An ethic of seeing and of being in the wake as consciousness, as a way of remembering and observing that started with the door of no return, continued in the hold of the ship and on the shore. So as we reimagine our food landscapes near and far, one thing is clear. Seeds of our food futures that are equitable and sustainable are in the stories, in the hopes, in the lives of Black residents and organizations that look beyond the conditions of non-survival to make a way forward. Thank you.